lesbian gay community, the transgender community, the bisexual community, and about sexuality in general. Sarah is the editor-in-chief of Out Magazine, the nation's largest gay and lesbian publication.
Do I have to use this thing? I'm definitely not into chapters, so I'm going to run loose and free here and throw out some ideas. I don't consider this such an enormously broad and infinitely fascinating and yet, highly argumentative topic that I wouldn't want to be definitive even about my own magazine, let alone what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years in this country alone, and some of the ripple effects in Europe and Asia and any number of places in terms of media. I guess the things that come to mind when I think about talking on this topic is even thinking about the differences that we've experienced in the last 5 years. I have had the pleasure or the tyranny of working at 2 different gay publications. I was the arts editor at Outweek magazine, which was a New York gay-based publication, the famous Outing magazine, as it were, although in fact it was many things more than that, and a very big newspaper, I think, for the city. But that's only to speak of one city, and in New York alone, there have been numerous gay papers coming and going. This year we lost a native. It's really kind of a complicated and interesting history. I think what is important to focus on now, specifically in response to Donald's sort of supposition for the evening, is what images do we want to put out to our nation or to the public at large, let alone to ourselves. And I think what comes up for me, being a sort of former comparative literature student from that, is who is we, and what does that mean? The notion that we can even control such images. I think the idea of presenting images, as you were saying, you present an image when you walk down the street, you present an image in a magazine, you present an image on TV, you present an image in film, you present an image in advertising, you present an image all over the place. I think what's fascinating at this point is that we have publications in this community alone as diverse as Girl Jock, XY, Bear, Genre, the formerly known Deneuve, now renamed Curve because of Ms. Catherine's objections. Papers like the Washington Blade that do hard news. We have porn, we have lifestyle, we have news. We have pretty much anything you can shake a stick at, and that's just talking about print media. We have television programs, we have access, cable access, we have Dyke TV, we have In the Life on PBS. We have representation in the mainstream from everything from the Birdcage to the theater with Angels in America and Love, Valor, Compassion. We have Ellen, as we are all fully aware of. We have gay and lesbian film festivals. We have everything from small gay book publishers to mainstream New York City book publishers to controversies in the New York Times over whether or not the publisher or the former publisher of Esquire, Ed Kosner, should publish Edmund White's latest piece of fiction full of sucking and fucking. So clearly, we have many, many images in 1997. I think one of the things that I have always been most interested in is really, really getting away from this notion that there is a we, and really trying to fight with the idea of, I think there's an internal resistance that always comes up when we say, what are the images we want to put out there? I think what the supposition behind that on some level for all of us is that if we can no longer control the images that are out there, we might somehow lose a level of power over ourselves. And in essence, what happens when there is an uncontrollable floating, or multiple uncontrollable floating definitions of what homosexuality is? I, for example, don't necessarily feel moved spiritually by the Ellen episode. I was, however, in a room with a heterosexual woman who loved Ellen. She lived for it. And for that moment, I thought to myself, this is great. This is good propaganda, because this woman, in some way, connected to this character, and it meant something for her. So to me, who cares what images we are putting out there? More to the point, what can those various things do to connect to people in any number of ways. Let me just hold up my own magazine as a, not so much for self-promotion, but for the very fact that you can make an argument out of anything. We are the largest circulation gay magazine in the country, Club. But we, as I say, are one of many, many magazines. And you could, for example, hold the mic for me, Daniel. You could open Out Magazine and you could follow some of the standard argument you might have about Out Magazine. Okay, Out Magazine is promoting good-looking guys. It's the classic self-loathing. I got a piece of hate mail today which told me I sucked. The pages of this magazine had been torn out and sent back to me. I sucked for making these images, apparently, of these handsome gentlemen in their bathing suits on the beach. Okay, so, all right, so I suck for that. Then you say, well, it's a self-loathing, like perpetuating the stereotypes, white, gay man, blah, blah, blah. Well, then you say, okay, well, turn to this page. It's a story on gay twins. And we have two transsexual twin sisters. And we have brothers and sisters of various races and ages and professions. And, well, then you're back at the mainstream media stuff that Out Magazine does. Here's Susan Speniger, who's a chef, who has her own television program and is doing quite well with it, and who we featured years ago when she wasn't doing very well at all. Well, wait, now we're back to the sort of white, straight male, sort of white gay male hegemonic images, and this here's a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, and this is the sort of traditional image that we see in the gay press of successful people, not the people on the margins. Well, then you turn forward and you say, well, here's a story on Atlanta and what happened when a bar was bombed down there and the different things that that meant for that community, specifically a lot of black activists in the gay community down there. And you say, well, you know, Out never really does that stuff very well anyway, even when it tries to. You say, well, here are the ordinary people in Out Magazine. Here's a story about gay men and lesbians having children together and what happens when gay men and lesbians try and raise kids, and what that brings up in terms of sexism and what that brings up in terms of men resenting, you know, feminist tendencies within the lesbian community and so on and so forth. Anyway, final riff on this. We go to the beginning of our feature well, which takes you through 5 years of the magazine, which includes men and women, people of various ages and races and professions and sexual inclinations from bisexual to transgender to lesbian to undecided. To straight, in fact, straight women playing lesbians, my favorite. But anyway, the point is that here is one issue of one magazine in the print media alone in 1997. And I would dare to say that it's not even vaguely definitive. So I think one thing that we can be happy about when we talk at this point about what images are we putting out to the world is that we are putting out a lot, and we are many people, and we have many options, which isn't to say you should even pick this same magazine up. But I think that the idea that we have some level of selection at this point is very refreshing. And of course, I'm sure there will be criticisms, but let's hear those because that's the best way to get ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. One of the complaints about images of specifically the lesbian and gay community, I think probably the transgender community as well, is that as some of these images have become successful and some of these images have become more widely seen, that the movement itself has sort of lost its edge. That activism has lost its edge, and that we really need to question the way that we present ourselves. There are many ways the royal we presents ourselves to the community, so that we can sort of re-examine what the implications of some of these images are politically. Daniel Mendelsohn's going to talk to us a bit about that. And Daniel is a New York-based writer and critic. He writes frequently about cultural issues for many publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, The Nation, and Out. At present, he's working on a book about gay male culture for Out. Thank you, Daniel.
I had originally had the brilliant idea of foregoing the pages that I had typed out because I think we probably at some point want to get to the discussion part of this. And then Sarah said everything that I was going to say off the cuff, so I'm going to go back to my typed comments and I'll read them really fast. But I'm also, coincidentally, the thing that's on my mind is, as well, Sarah and I have had many discussions and arguments about this, is this idea of who the we is, and what the image is. I mean, this is essentially not really purely a cultural question, but really it's a political question when you're talking about the image that you're going to be projecting out there. And I would, just before I sort of get going, I would just say that the mainstream is probably as varied and fickle and indefinable as all of these sub-mainstreams to which some of us like to think that we belong. And so the whole question of mainstream itself is a sort of next one, I think, that needs to be opened up more, because it's never really clear, except in sort of very gross terms, what the mainstream is. Anyway, this is the thing that I wanted to discuss is a kind of a meta story about how I came to some of these ideas. A few months ago, Donald had asked me to come here to take part in this panel about the representation of gays in the media. And he did so at least partly because of a much-loathed article that I wrote for New York Magazine last September, which Donald was nice enough to mention to me when he spoke to me on the phone, which led me to believe that he was one of the 3 people who did not loathe the piece. In the article, I had observed that an inevitable side effect of what can roughly refer to as the mainstreaming of gay culture, the thing that Urvashi Bad bemoaned in a recent book of hers, and the thing that presumably Andrew Sullivan and others on that side of the equation presumably thought. The mainstreaming effect, this effect of the question of civil rights, marriage, military service, economic and social parity in many ways, was that what had once been a clear-cut social and aesthetic gay identity had become blurred, and it was increasingly difficult as mainstreaming progressed to see what, if anything, made the gay men living in ghettos like Chelsea all that different, ideologically speaking, from the mainstream culture. The ironic, self-consciously stylish, subversive gay male persona of an earlier era, I had argued, could only have evolved in an outsider's culture, and hence was bound to become more and more obsolete as more and more gay men were able to enjoy the perquisites of the society from which they had once been excluded totally. That is, as greater numbers of gay people became insiders. And indeed, much of the gay culture that's being produced these days, I think, arguably, isn't all that different from much of the straight culture in terms of both content and style. The dominant sensibility has undergone a sea change. After the article came out, I found myself in a peculiar, though by no means unfamiliar, position of being denounced by both the left and the right. The left disapproved of my use of ghettos such as Chelsea as models for discussing gay culture in the first place. And it's certainly a criticism that I have taken to heart. Not, quote, not all gay men are pumped up white boys whose biggest worry is what color light their shorts to buy, one person literally wrote to me. The right, on the other hand, inevitably nervous about style, found my perhaps too wistful remembrance of subversiveness past to be disturbing. Most gay men, they said, weren't really interested in subversive style. Not all gays were fashion victims or opera queens. And anyway, after years of political progress, they wrote, why was I looking back yearningly to an era of oppression simply because it may have produced more interesting art? But what was really interesting to me, and what is, I hope, germane to this discussion tonight, what's interesting about both the left and the right attacks on this kind of thinking is an underlying belief that I had somehow misrepresented a reality of what gay culture really is like, or perhaps should be like, and that again brings us to the political question. There is, of course, no single monolithic reality of what gay experience is like, nor indeed is there a single monolithic reality of what a human gay person is like. And one of the sort of effects of having to think through these issues for myself is to realize how, in my own sort of conflictedness about these kind of ideological and cultural issues, how conflicted one is oneself, that unlike manifestos, a human being can be more than one thing at the same time. And I think that's something we should always keep in mind. We are complex as individuals. I myself have written primarily, I guess, about what I think are some of the benefits of mainstreaming in political and sometimes cultural terms. And I have argued in print against, say, the politicization in quote-unquote queer terms of literature and intellectual life. Yet I am constantly and simultaneously aware that for any subculture, the move to the mainstream inevitably entails a loss of distinctiveness. And one of the problems of being an American is establishing what one's identity is, because there's no such thing as being an American in the way that there is such a thing, I think, as being, say, a German to a certain extent. And so as Americans, those of us who are Americans, we sort of glom onto hyphenated identities in many ways, and we feel threatened when the identities are threatened. And the way that those hyphens get threatened is through mainstream. So in that light, I can also write with some regret about the loss of a certain and very distinctive gay cultural edge over the past few years. These levels of what you could call ideological conflictedness, both cultural and individual, have only recently been allowed to appear at the surface of gay culture, I think, primarily because we're now strong enough in many ways to acknowledge our own complexity and diversity in a way that we weren't before. Before, when just to get into print as a gay person was a huge battle, gay writers and journalists were more likely, I think, to present, or indeed to want to present, a more or less united front. We were a one-issue community in certain senses. But our very successes have engendered what looks often like divisiveness, but what in fact is just diversity, which everyone at least claims to want. This brings me rather too haphazardly to the theme of tonight's discussion, which is how the gay community presents itself through the media to the mainstream world. And I guess as a writer, I'm media. That theme, very Menotti, that theme begs the question of just what the gay community is, and this is where Sarah stole a little thunder. And I'll say here that what I've always said, which is that the gay culture and gay community and gay people are probably three discrete things, and they are not necessarily concentric. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. And as New Yorkers, it's especially important to keep in mind, I think, because a lot of culture is made in New York, but I'm not so sure that means, I think that's why culture is not equal to people in many respects. Gay culture doesn't mean all gay people, but if anything refers to what is produced by a fairly small percentage of gay people, I think, for the consumption of a somewhat larger percent of gay people. Gay community, I always suspect, refers more or less to the same phenomenon in a purely political sphere. It's the word that activists on both left and right use to describe the people who will presumably be the benefits of their own brands of activism. I'm sure Urvashi Bad's idea of what the gay community is and needs is rather different from what Andrew Sullivan's gay community looks like. Like God, we fashion our constituencies and our own images. The reason that they have to do so is that gay people are a diverse and ultimately indefinable sociological quantity and can't be corralled into any convenient pigeonholes. And this is getting back to what Sarah was talking about, which is difficult for pundits and politicians and even cultural writers, but probably very good for the gay people themselves, who should be allowed to be whatever the hell it is that they should be. So how should the gay community be represented in the media? I don't know. If you represent opera queens, the Log Cabin Boys are going to be upset because, as everyone knows, not all gay people love opera. If you play it straight, as it were, if you give the sexless Ring Grandma and the dog version of gay life in the movies, then the queer contingent is going to raise the cry of whitewashing. And every time a gay film is released, and sometimes I have to review them, I think, whatever you do, you're going to get screwed, because if it's, it's always, half the equation is always upset, if it's Philadelphia, it's bad because that's not how it really is. And if it's something else, if it's Gregoraki, it's bad because a lot of gay people live in Westchester, and, there's no way to get around it. And that's just as it should be, because, there are a lot of different parts of the equation. So every time something happens like that, every time a book is published or a movie comes out, somebody gets hysterical because it's not really us. We're not really drag queens going cross country. We don't really wear nipple rings. That's Bruce Bauer's favorite. We're not really residents of Westchester. But of course, it's never going to be really us because we aren't really any single thing. And as journalists and writers and filmmakers and editors, I think, in conclusion, the best thing that we can do as the face of this society is more and more completely revealed in its complexity, It's just to track each phenomenon as truthfully and as accurately as we can, and to leave the glib caption writing where it belongs, in the people section of Time.
Thank you very much. I actually came out to myself when I was a teenager, early in my teenage years, because I was watching American Bandstand and a disco singer named Sylvester came on. Does anyone know Sylvester? Okay, great. Thank you. We're old, huh? And so I'm sitting there in front of the television as a teenager, and I see this plump, full figure, black gay band dressed up like Cleopatra, singing this song, on American Bandstand, and I figured that if, he's out there and he's okay, that it's going to be just fine for me. Which I think brings home the point that it's really important for all of us to see images that really reflect who we are, or that we can relate to. And one of the complaints that people have had about some of the images we see in the mainstream is that they too seldom reflect the racial diversity, or even the sexual diversity of our community. So today we're lucky enough to have Cary Alan Johnson with us. He's a writer, he's an activist, and an Africanist. He has worked in Zaire during the Burundi refugee crisis and in Rwanda in the aftermath of that country's civil war. He's been active in gay politics since 1980, and Johnson has also been involved with the Committee of Black Gay Men, Other Countries, and Gay Men of African Descent. Please help me in welcoming Cary Alan Johnson.
I want to thank the Goethe Institute and the Center and Donald Suggs especially for asking me to be on the panel. I've been hibernating a little bit lately, and it's good to be able to get out and share some of my ideas. The question of what public images gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people should present would seem at first to be a simple question. Our public persona should be reflective of the diversity of who we are and all of its untidiness. Well, we're black, we are white, we're Asian, we're Latino, we're butch queens, we're Miss Things, we're bodybuilders, male and female. We're monogamous, we're polygamous, we're street sluts. We're poor and we're rich, we live in Chelsea and we live in Harlem, and some of us live in tea rooms. We're snow queens, rice queens, and dinge queens, and yes, some of us are racists. If we are to grow personally and as a community along psychic and spiritual lines, our public images must reflect back to us both the beauty and the ugliness of who we are. This argument, by the way, recognizes no conflict between, on one hand, the need to see accurate, albeit unlovely, images of who we are in order to be able to face our shortcomings, and the need to present a positive face of the queer community to the larger society in order to gain acceptance. In the age-old argument of whether we should air our so-called dirty laundry in public, a simple telling of the truth should always win out. And this is certainly evidenced by the experience of the African-American community in the media, in which we've learned that if we do not accurately portray our struggles and our failures, the media will do a much more savage job at it for us. But for black gays and lesbians, the notion of the manipulation of public images is a tough one to get a grip on because we have had so little control or even influence over how we are seen. Images of black gays are determined and then fed to the public by what I see as three sets of forces. The straight or straight-thinking general media, and I say straight-thinking because a lot of the people who are running that media are in fact gay and lesbian, but think with straight minds. The gay and lesbian media itself, and finally, the shapers of black pop culture. The larger culture, or the mainstream, as difficult as that may be to define, has been more or less unconcerned with the existence of black gays, lesbians, trans people. Black gays and lesbians are conspicuously absent from the few TV shows, major magazine features, movies, and pop music accounts which shape the public vision of gay life. And perhaps that's been a blessing for us. When we are present, our blackness is incidental or disconnected from our gay identities. I'd like to give, for an example, an episode of Rock, which was on a few years ago, in which Richard Roundtree played Rock's gay brother. And it was a priceless opportunity. Richard Roundtree in the 70s was the icon of black masculinity. He played Shaft in the Shaft series, and this was an opportunity. Here Shaft is gay, and this was. But I think that the marriage in that story, in which Richard Roundtree's character married a white gay man, diminished any real impact that otherwise brave story might have had on the black community. For many black viewers, Richard Roundtree's character came to be seen as not really part of the community, but a mere visitor from the other side. And word has it that the black gay character on Spin City is about to his lover is about to come on the show, and I understand his lover, if it hasn't happened yet, is supposed to be played by Isaac Mizrahi, the fashion designer. Black gays and lesbians have not fared much better in the gay media. From early on, we have been invisibilized and cannibalized and presented as mere objects to be seen through the eyes of white gay men. In her fascinating study on images of black men in physique magazines of the 50s, Dr. Tracy Morgan points out the paucity of black male images and notes that when black men are present in these early versions of pornography, we are accompanied by things like barrels, ropes, and other signs of toil and labor. The newfound economic control of its own media that the white gay community has found has not been, in my opinion, any kinder to black gays. Black men and other men of color, though more represented numerically, are usually seen on the arms of white men. In magazines such as Out, Christopher Street, The Advocate, and in movies such as Longtime Companion, Parting Glances, Jeffrey, and others, men of color are mere appendages on the arms of their white leading men. Sissy versions of the black sidekick flicks of the 80s. When talking about the gay media, it's critical, I think, to address the AIDS/HIV industry and the public information material that it has generated. And I want to just take, for example, this ad that's been done by Glaxo Wellcome, which I'm sure all of you have seen around town. It's on just about every bus kiosk. I wish I could pass it around, but there's something wrong with this image. Knowing what we know about the demographics of HIV as we move towards the year 2000, in which 50% of the cases of HIV in this country will be among African Americans, and given that this ad is geared towards the gay community, there's something wrong. I'm not here. I don't see myself. And the saddest thing about this ad, I think, is that it was done in collaboration with NMAC, the National Minority AIDS Council, who really should have known better. We are manipulated, I believe, by public images into believing that a black man could not possibly love another black man. We buy into this, and as a result, our relationships go unsupported, even by the public images that we create. Finally, the public images of black gays and black pop culture are perhaps more important to explore, as black straight people, also a difficult group to define, are arguably more influenced by what happens on Moesha than what happens on Ellen. Here we see the same old stereotypes that have worked for the black community since slavery. The black homosexual as queen, as bitch, as one step below woman, if you will, in this twisted heterosexist notion. For example, the hairdresser in the novel Waiting to Exhale. For example, the hairdresser in Hollywood Shuffle. For example, the hairdresser in the hit play The Beauty Shop. The men on film sequences On Living Color. The black fag, always ready to kiki, to do your nails, and to lend a sympathetic ear, but never upsetting the tidy, heterosexist structure which dictates that men sex women, and anyone who wants to take it up the ass must be a woman or something close to it, anything but a man. In this context, it is perhaps the butch queen who is the most subversive. A masculine black man who desires other masculine black men is perhaps the most threatening image of all to straight black, and even white gay culture. The whispered message from the black identified butch queen is, we don't need any of you. We love ourselves as black men. And that is why such images are so rare. The novels of such black writers as Elin Harris and James Earl Hardy, you've seen them. If you haven't read them, everyone else has read them. while introducing the straight black community to a certain slice of gay culture, perpetuate the myths that masculine black men must, by definition, be bisexual and are not really gay. These novels, while perhaps written with black gay men in mind, are published, I believe, with black straight women as the target audiences. They do little to present positive or even well-rounded images of healthy black gay men living their lives with a modicum of pride, self-respect, or self-knowledge. In the final analysis, the question of the manipulation of public images is a somewhat frightening one. Its surface simplicity begs a deeper exploration. Can black gay men and other black men who have sex with men really start to think about controlling our public images when we have yet to come to terms with our personal images? For myself and for many of my friends, it often appears that low self-esteem, no self-esteem, and shade are the credos of popular black gay culture. Mimicking the savage body fascism of white gay men, we have created our own beefcake magazines, fuel for the fire of body hatred. In personal ads and on phone lines, we look for men who are, quote-unquote, straight acting. We want to do it on the down low. We are warned to keep it real, a code for eliminating any traces of unmasculine behavior. We throw parties at which admission is based on having an acceptable waistline, proper pecs, and a tight butt. We are in fact trapped in images of who we think we ought to be. Meanwhile, we die of drug addiction, unsafe sex, and loneliness. We are for the most part powerless over how we will be seen. Our only hope rests in first determining who we really are and creating the relationships and institutions which support the totality of our choices and make us feel good about ourselves. With this process underway, how we go public becomes much less important than how we live our private lives.
Our last speaker tonight is going to be Leslie Feinberg, and she's a transgender and anti-racist activist, author of the novel Stone Butch Blues, and the nonfiction work Transgender Warriors, which is making history from Joan of Arc to Dennis Rodman. It's just released in paperback from Beacon. I want you all to buy it directly after the presentation. For many of us who come from places sort of outside New York, people who sort of didn't fit the stereotype of what men were supposed to be or what women were supposed to be were the only people who were visibly queer. I know where I came from, everybody else was hiding. So for many of us, the transgender community really has been out there at the forefront, being most visible and taking a lot of the abuse that's really meant for us all. So this is one of the reasons why I've always seen transgender people as being, as I said, at the forefront of the movement, and Leslie's really at the forefront of articulating and bringing out issues that touch transgender and all people, you know, as part of an all-encompassing sort of view of who is oppressed and who is rendered invisible in society. So I'm very happy to have her here tonight. Please welcome Leslie Feinberg.
Thank the organizers of tonight's event, and in particular to thank Donald Suggs. Really, Donald, for being consistent, one of the best allies that the trans communities have had, and in turn, I and I hope others in our community will be, we vow, the best fighters and allies for the people of color communities, because I think that's really the key for how we build the kind of solidarity and trust that's necessary to forge coalitions. In the interest of staying to my 10 minutes, I'm going to read my talk. I know it's late. But as a blue-collar, Jewish, internationalist, anti-racist, transgender, lesbian, trade unionist, and socialist, there's a lot I could say about the lessons of the German homosexual emancipation movement and the rise of fascism in Germany. But I'm limiting my remarks tonight to one particular lesson of coalition building that I think holds great importance for our movement today. And that is the question of wedding transgender liberation with the struggle for lesbian, gay, and bisexual liberation, although clearly that union does not always produce a same-sex marriage. The fierce rebellion at the Stonewall Bar in 1969, led by African-American, Latina, and poor white drag queens, transsexuals, and butches, did not usher in, as we've said, the first wave of gay liberation in this century. And it was also not the first time that gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans people fought on the front lines for gay liberation. Trans activists were among the leaders and the ranks of the early German gay rights movement. And trans issues played a significant role in both the theory and the politics that emanated from that movement. In fact, trans people had led battles against enslavement and hunger, privatization, exploitation, and war on the European continent long before the 1890s. In Transgender Warriors, I offer evidence that the very roots of trans oppression, I believe, are intertwined with the oppression of women, the systematic development of racism, the outlawing of same-sex and bisexual love. And I believe that it's important for us today to remember that all class-riven economic systems, be they chattel slave or feudal or capitalist, cannot survive without dividing their vast laboring classes and pitting that majority against each other. And no other fact makes a greater or more winning argument for unity. Transgender played a militant and important role in the struggles on the European continent, from slave resistance to peasant uprisings to militant strikes and rebellions at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, to the emergence of the first historic wave for gay liberation in Germany. And that movement rose on the groundswell of the struggle by workers to win the most basic democratic rights. The first sparks of resistance to gay oppression in Germany actually dates back to around the early 1960s. That was a period in which early industrial capitalism had transformed serfs into wage slaves. On North American continent, the struggle by the northern industrialists against the slave-owning aristocracy was about to break out into the bloodiest battle of the 19th century, the Civil War. Europe was sacking, rooting up, and destroying whole indigenous cultures from Africa to Asia. And many of those conquered cultures had still been based on group cooperative labor, societies in which trans people and same-sex love, women, youth, and elders had been treated with dignity and respect. But the conquering colonial cultural values and property relations put straight, wealthy white men at the pinnacle of power. Germany had few colonies. While it had a powerful industrial base, it was weakened by remnants of feudalism and was still divided into almost 300 countries. Prussia, which was then devouring all the other German states except Hanover, had a very harsh anti-gay law, which turned out to be a spark that ignited the emergence of the German homosexual emancipation movement in the early 1890s. Throughout the next 7 decades of this movement, trans issues and research were integral to its growth and development. And as I said, gay and lesbian trans activists were amongst the movement's leadership. In 1897, the first gay liberation organization was born in Germany, named the Scientific Humanitarian Union. Its founder and notable leader was Magnus Hirschfeld, who was gay, Jewish, feminine, a socialist, and, some say, also a cross-dresser. Hirschfeld also coined the word transvestite and wrote the germinal works on the subject. One of his most important contributions was documenting that being a cross-dresser did not automatically determine a person's sexuality. Some cross-dressers were gay, some were not. In other words, then, as now, the gay and transgender populations overlapped. The committee published a yearbook on literary, historical, anthropological, and scientific studies that dealt with transgender as well as homosexuality. And I would argue that the nature versus nurture debate at the time was also framed as a transgender question. And we are listening to similar controversy today. Are we born with our sexuality already coded for life? Do we develop sexuality as we grow and interact with the world? Or is there an as yet undetermined interconnection between the two? Karl Ulrichs, the grandfather of gay liberation, argued in the latter half of the 19th century that a homosexual was a member of a third sex, one whose body developed as one sex and whose mind developed as another. For example, he believed a gay man who was a male born with a female brain. This debate over whether gays and lesbians were born as a third sex shaped part of the direction of that movement. Many German lesbians and gays fought against their persecution on the basis that they could not change their sexual orientation because it was inborn. Others at that time stressed that this was a weak defensive argument and that human rights should be fought for on the basis of justice, not pathology. Of course, it was one thing for this debate to take place within the lesbian and gay movement. It was another matter when the question of what causes homosexuality was used as part of the basis for the Nazis' program of mass sterilization and murder of those considered racially, sexually, physically, or mentally inferior in order to build up a master race. Much of the valuable history that had been excavated by the German gay rights movement was lost with the rise of fascism. In 1933, the Institute was burned to the ground by the Nazis, and more than 10,000 volumes were destroyed in those flames. We don't know how many of those forced into factory slavery who were tortured or killed in concentration camps were feminine men or masculine women, were cross-dressers of all sexualities, or how many would identify today as transsexual or intersexual. Yet the evidence remains that the German gay rights movement was an important example of one of the historic moments when lesbian, gay, bi, and trans struggles have been entwined. Today, we are again faced with the question of the interrelationship between the lesbian, gay, bi, and trans communities. Many communities are included under the umbrella term of trans or transgender, including transsexual men and women, heterosexual cross-dressers, drag queens and drag kings, masculine women and feminine men, two-spirits, intersexuals, people referred to in the past as hermaphrodites, bi-gender people who want to be able to express both their feminine and their masculine sides, androgynes, shapeshifters, morphers, bearded women who allow their facial hair to grow, and women weightlifters who work hard at the gym only to discover they can't safely use a public women's bathroom. The basis for lesbian, gay, bi, and trans unity is not that we share a common sexuality. Not even lesbians, gays, and bisexuals all express our sexuality in identical ways. And if you doubt that for a second, thumb through some of the personal ads in our community presses. We built the gay liberation movement in order to defend our sexual freedom and to confront and battle the discrimination and violence we face. And those oppressions are linked to the struggle for trans liberation as well. To those who can only remain in power through a divide and conquer strategy, same-sex love, ambisexuality, cross-dressing, sex change, we are all queer with a capital Q. We're fighting for many of the same goals and many interrelated goals. For example, lesbian and gay liberation proved that being born male or female did not mandate what sex you would feel attracted to in later life. And now trans liberation is revealing that individuals are not just attracted to a particular sex, but that desire incorporates gender preference as well, for example, like femininity or masculinity or androgyny or gender contradiction. And all forms of sex and gender oppression both limit human potential in terms of self-expression and do damage to all of humanity. Trans liberation is shaking up oppressive beliefs backed up by bigoted laws. No one's fluidity of gender or sex reassignment threatens your right to self-expression. On the contrary, my battle for my right to be me is also a defense of your right to be you. We are in fact trying to open up more avenues of self-definition, identity, love, and desire. And lastly, our communities overlap. Gay, lesbian, and bi, queens and butches, drag queens and kings, he, she's, and she-males, transsexuals, those called bull-dagger or just plain married, have throughout history fought on the front lines for sexual liberation. It's not an accident, as I began, that African American and Latina and poor white drag queens, transsexuals, and butches were on the front lines of the Stonewall Rebellion that helped usher in the modern lesbian, gay, bi, and trans liberation movement. I asked Stonewall combatant Sylvia Rivera recently, in June 1969, when you were fighting in front of the Stonewall, did you fight back because of the police brutality? Were you fighting racism because so many in the bar were young and homeless and had to turn tricks in order to live? Or against the constant confrontations with brutality and degradation? And Sylvia, with quiet dignity, replied, we were fighting for our lives. I can't say it more succinctly or more eloquently. When our backs are against the wall, we need to come out fighting together, shoulder to shoulder. We cannot let ourselves be divided. Lesbian, gay, bi liberation is inextricably linked to the struggle for trans liberation. And those freedoms can't be achieved without at the same time battling racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and disabled discrimination. And our fight is not over until we have won economic and social equality for each person. That's the lesson of Stonewall. That's the lesson of Germany.
We still have a bit of time for discussion for those who would like to stay. We've really heard from a very wide spectrum of voices tonight, and in the interest of maybe bridging the gap between the early gay rights movement and today's movement, and because I helped organize it, I'm going to ask the first question, which is from Mr. Stakeley. The description of the split in the early gay rights movement between those who felt that we should sort of embrace the diversity of our community sexually, in terms of gender identity, etc., and the more sort of conservative, more sort of strictly gender, well, not gender focused, but yeah, gender, right, masculinist wing seems to be a kind of a cautionary tale. Especially when you look at it at a time when an increasingly conservative government was taking over. What do you think the early German gay rights movement has to teach us about the situation today, and about the importance of bringing those two camps together?
Well, there are many lessons, as we heard from Leslie, many, but I'll just point to two, and perhaps others might want to add a few more. One of them is, I guess, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. It's a cliche, but it's true. Hirschfeld was an optimist and sort of guided by that idea of historical progress in the 19th century, and thought that gay liberation or gay equality was almost inevitable. Society keeps progressing, and yet the huge backlash of the Nazi period suggests that we can't take any of the progress that we've made in this country or made other countries for granted, because it can all be undone. And then the second lesson that seems to be very important is that the wing of the gay movement, which, as I described, kind of went pro-Nazi in an opportunistic way, utilized all these militaristic images, was the one that was totally fixated on nation and a kind of a single racial ideal. There was a kind of a great homogeneity of what they wanted and traditional sexuals, whereas the Hirschfeld wing of the movement, which unfortunately was defeated, was by the historical forces, was the one that was pushing for alliance building with women and with other progressive causes, with, as Leslie described it, with the transgender, transsexual community of that time. And those people were lumped. You know, there are studies that show why the forces that brought people together in alliances weren't strong enough at that time. In particular, what people look at is splits that took place within the left wing of Germany at that time, between the socialists and communists. That was a very divisive battle. And what German history shows us is the importance of maintaining those coalitions and not allowing differences between close political allies, which sometimes we blow those differences out of proportion. It's like the narcissism of small differences in a way. You get fixated on the small differences you have, and you don't see that the main enemy is somewhere else completely. So I think that those are two lessons that one can extract from German history, and perhaps the others have some others to add.
Would like to take some questions for our panelists.
The feeling I'm getting is that the creation of the images is really driven by market forces. Does the panel believe that this is true? Sort of an economic Darwinism?
That the creation of the kind of images we see is due to market forces, and it's a kind of cultural Darwinism?
Economic Darwinism.
A kind of economic Darwinism.
If so, what is the responsibility that people who make the media have in it?
Would like to respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think you're right, you know, and it's some, you know, at a certain level, depending on whose point of view you're thinking from, you know, the people who create the stuff that is being sold on the market, just, you know, the only obligation they have, strictly speaking, is, you know, presumably to the people, you know, buying shares in their company. I mean, that's not what our concern is here. But I mean, these, you know, this sort of explosion of stuff for the gay market in the past, say, 15 years is, for example, of gay magazines and gay newspapers and gay books especially, and gay movies, is not, I don't think, so much due to ideology, although it's certainly kind of intertwined, but it's because there was suddenly a gay market. And this is sort of good old-fashioned capitalism at work. And once there was a clearly identifiable gay market to buy stuff, you know, people came up with it. You know, so I think market force is an extremely important part of this equation. And then the people who produce, who are quite often themselves lesbian and gay, et cetera, people, find themselves in the delicate position of trying to maintain, I think, some kind of ideological integrity while also trying to sell their stuff, their magazine or whatever it is that they're producing. So, I mean, but I think that market forces is what has created all of this. You know, it's not accidental.
I have two thoughts on that. One is it's going to be perhaps very unpopular, but I actually would suggest that capital, maybe Leslie would argue back, but I would suggest that capital has played, in the initial period of the recent past, a very positive force on the number of gay images we have. I mean, I guess Cary doesn't like Elin's book, but I think it's an amazing fact that an out gay man is writing a New York Times bestseller, and that he's speaking about black gay male experience on some level to mass audience. I think it's quite amazing that someone like Maria Magenta can make a movie about two young teenage girls in love, and it can be in movie theaters that my aunt in South Jersey can go see. I mean, I think that there is obviously a huge amount of cynicism we want to have about that. But I think that the fact that the market has allowed a lot of gay talent that, for example, came out of activist circles to go forth and present the work that they've done to the world in the way that Leslie's book is out there from a mainstream publishing house is certainly something not to be entirely cynical about. I think the thing that is the more complicated thing is what this notion of mainstreaming is. And that's what Daniel sort of brought up, but that's the thing that still has me very confused, and I encounter it on a daily basis. This idea that people now say, oh, well, we don't, just to take a small example, we don't want to, for example, have Ellen DeGeneres do an interview in the gay press. We want to mainstream that show. We don't want a movie poster for a lesbian movie to have the faces of the two lesbian characters in it because we want to mainstream it. We'd rather have a cartoon drawing that shows two hands clasping. It's things like that that I think are the more problematic thing. People who want to get the market in terms of the money, and they want the gay audience, but they don't really want to acknowledge having the gay audience. It's this weird, there's a definite homophobia there, and that's where I think it's more complicated. Everyone's fine with the idea of the gay market niche, and how they address it and how they respect it, I think, is a much different matter.
I'll use mine. I just want to clarify, I think Elin is a gifted writer, and I like his book. And I also want to say that Elin is also an important financial contributor to the Black gay movement. In my comments, what I'm talking about is not so much not liking his novels, but feeling that there is a narrowness in the images of Black gay men that are allowed to appear in novels. That there is some notion that the market will not sustain a diversity of Black gay characters. And in my view, the Black gay love story has yet to be published. I'm sure it's been written somewhere, but it has yet to be published because there's some notion that the market won't sustain it. The gentleman mentioned about economic forces, and just to go back to magazines like Out and like The Advocate, there is also some. We read, Black gay men read, and lesbians, we read these publications. We read HX. We pick it up, but there is, the economic power that we do have to be able to say we are absent. Our images are not present in these magazines, and until they are present, we're going to boycott the advertisers. We're not going to pick up these publications. We're going to write letters. We have not yet garnered that support. And I have to say that the few, as you went through your riff, as you called it, you kind of quickly sped through those sort of people of color images. I think if we looked at them closer, we would find that based on our numbers, the number of people who read your magazine, the number of Black gays and lesbians that are part of your target audience, the numbers are not sustained in the people of color images in your advertising, in your articles, etc. So I want to be clear, because Elin is also a friend of mine. And I wanted to get back to that.
Well, just in closing, too, I think that it's a question of who we credit with the kind of diversity that has been won, to the extent that diverse images are more present for people to see, to read, to listen to, is whether we credit the market or whether we credit the struggle of our movements. And, just taking the question of publishing, for example, it took militant, young gay liberation and the development of adding lesbian to that in the early years to be able to produce the kind of independent presses that were offsprings of the movement that gave voice to people who had been rendered invisible and silent by the publishing world up till then. There are not enough publishers, even in the movement, who gave real equal or a kind of generous movement affirmative action to the voices of people who have been silenced. But it did create the ability for people who had not been heard before to be published in many cases. In turn, the movement helped to create audiences of people and organize them around wanting to read about their own lives or see themselves represented. Created bookstores that in some cities as were both small businesses and at the same time community centers where nothing else existed. What's happened now with the market as the increasing tend towards and drive towards monopolization has occurred is that now we're seeing the small presses, the independent bookstores, and the independent distributors being forced under in what has been described in the last 18 months as the equivalent of a 1929 market crash for independent publishing and book selling. It's not because there's a depression, although clearly many of us have a lot less money than we want to buy books, but it's the opening of superstores like Barnes & Noble and the major publishing houses opening up lesbian gay imprints or trying to soak up those markets and absorb them. And as a result, many of the small presses and bookstores and distributors are either going under or on the verge of going under. And then we have to ask, when these industries have been monopolized, when Barnes & Noble is also the publisher and also the distributor, or vice versa, Simon & Schuster is the superstore bookstore and also the distributor, will that also create, again, that old homogenization of images of white, male, narrow experiences that don't represent the diversity, or will we wage the kind of struggle that won whatever inclusion you got and fight to expand?
Yes, I'm sorry.
At the risk of being redundant, I'd just like to echo some of the sentiments raised by Cary and to ask the panel in general, don't you appreciate how, as exciting as the Ellen episode might be, or as exciting as it might be to be able to ride the subway train and see all kinds of obviously straight people reading the work, how disquieting it is as well, because one begins to have a feeling, a la the log cabin Republicans, that there is a new breed of gay person who primary mission out of self-loathing seems to be to present a gay image, which is the kind of gay image that straight people want to be able to consume. Straight people want to be able to say, I'm comfortable with this sort of notion of a gay person, and I don't want to see these other out front, in your face kind of people, because they're disquieting to me, and I certainly don't want to see women who seem to me to be feminine and beautiful, who are lesbian, or men who seem to be masculine and virile, who are homosexual.
I think that all images which are affirmative to the mainstream are not that we want to be. When I came to America, I was first impressed, or the first impression was that there are so many different images of gays living beneath the other. And as a German, I asked, how is it possible that they are not in conflict together? I think it's a very American thing to do this, but I think it's also managed by political correctness. So you see, the lesbian says, you as a gay man, you are not allowed to oppress me. And he said, of course, because I'm a democratic American man, I'm democratic, I will not do that. As next, the African-born gay man comes and says, oh, you as a lesbian woman, you don't speak on me, you don't aware me. And I think to present other images to the mainstream, or one step to do it, was to come out of the political correctness, not always speak from us as victims of the other, but to discuss really the conflicts between the different images, not to have them one beneath the other, and to say, okay, we are democratic people, we let live the other, but to return to a discussion which reflects the conflicts between or behind these images. The images, you show us the Out magazine and says, oh, there are so many different images, and you put them just beneath the other. But I think in former times, in the beginning of the second wave of the gay and lesbian movement, there were very heavy conflicts between these images. But now they are settled, and I think settled one beneath the other. And this is one problem, to show new kind of images to the mainstream, because we always said, yeah, we have different images, but we can't say what is the core of all these, or the common core of all these images.
I wanted to say that if you ride the subway and you look at who is reading James Earl Hardy's B-Boy Blues and Elin Harris's Just As I Am, yeah, a lot of black gay men read them, but who I see reading those books are straight black women. And there's something, you gotta look at that, because what has rendered us so palatable in these books that people who are in general, who have certain levels of homophobia, can read these books sort of like they're Sidney Sheldon novels and be okay with them. You know, Elin has finished or is writing a gay love story that is not about black men grappling with the issue of bisexuality, which is what his other books are about, which is what B-Boy Blues is about. His new book is not about bisexuality. It is being published under a pseudonym. His publisher is not. It is not being published under his name because he has established a niche as a writer of a certain type of novels with a certain audience, and the book that he's currently writing will cause some problems for those images that he has created. So we really need to look at, you know, why isn't there a diversity of black gay male images available in novels? Certainly, we read, you know, there's enough of a market to sustain it, but it's just not being, we're not demanding it. That's part of it.
But by the same token, do I need? Yeah. Okay. But by the same token, I mean, some of this strikes me as being a sort of glass half empty or half full problem, right? I mean, because, you know, everybody would say wants, you know, their proper quotient of representation. And yet, so we're finally at a stage where people are sitting on the subway, you know, reading gay novels.
Those aren't gay novels.
Well, I'm not so sure. You know, either it's not a gay novel and they're still guilty of homophobia, even unaware homophobia, even though they thought they were buying a gay novel. Right? Or then there's some standard for gayness in novels, which we will then have to sort of apply, you know, to all of these works that are being written. And I'm not so sure. I just think it's a sort of exquisitely vexed question. You know, as soon as people start reading gay novels, do we have to presume that they are actually still homophobic and the novels are just wussy? Or, you know, when do we stop doing that? Because let's say somebody does write the black, butch, you know, the novel that you were talking about, right? And then we see some, you know, white chick on the subway reading that novel. And then we say, well, maybe it wasn't butch enough, or maybe it wasn't black enough, because obviously there's that white chick reading the novel. So I think that we get, you know, this sort of infinite regress of you know, this sort of invisible standard. Now, I know what you're saying, but I think that we have to sort of, you know, stand back and see exactly what it is we want to happen. Because if for generations you say, oh, we want to be able to walk down the street holding hands, and then you see them walking down the street holding hands, and you say, well, they're wearing plaid flannel shirts, but, you know, they should be wearing pink satin dresses, and then you'd be successful. I'm not so sure this is a game that has any kind of ending, and I'm not, I mean, we should, well, that may be true, but I mean, it's also substantive progress that is being made, that is being reflected in these things, and I mean, I myself have sort of flip-flopped on this, because sometimes you think, oh, well, anybody watches that movie. You know, like Birdcage, you know, what, you know, that is, you know, very kind of candy-coated in a way. But then you say, well, do we have to sort of force people at gunpoint to watch, Paris is burning, as though it were medicine, because then the implication is that there is in fact something about the real gay experience or the real drag experience that is in fact unpleasant and bitter and has to be sort of taken with a spoonful of sugar. So I think as we discuss these things and as we sort of engage in this conversation, we have to be very sensitive to our own discourse, because sometimes we end up sort of buying into the very arguments that we started out trying to refute.
Speaking of quotients of representation, we're taking a lesbian question. Yes, we're taking a lesbian question. There we go.
Well, this isn't a lesbian question.
Question from a lesbian.
Where are the images of the families of gays?
Well, I mean, I showed you one in my magazine for this month. It was a story about two lesbians and a gay man who lived together in New Jersey and raised 3 children.
No, I don't mean that. I mean the parents.
The parents.
I've gone once or twice to gay parade in the it's called Blue Flag.
Yeah, they're
Very, very small contingent.
Well, actually, Blue Flag is an enormously powerful organization, and that's a very good point. Actually, we haven't done very much on that in my magazine, and I haven't seen a lot of it in general, which is from that other side of the coin. And I think that's, to me, that's a lot of the places where we have to start doing work, which is finding out the not quote-unquote gay stories, but the stories that are bigger than that. I just to go back to this other thing we were talking about, I have to say that in my mind, we have to also keep in mind that there are really different forms and different results we want. We don't want the same thing out of a birdcage movie that we want out of a Marilyn Hacker poem, that we don't, that we want out of a documentary on Sage, that we want out of a mainstream television program. These are incredibly different mediums, and they're targeted towards different audiences, and they're for different purposes. And I think that if everything becomes the same, and it all becomes narrowly focused towards this idea of whatever this moment, this ideal golden moment of acceptance is, then we're all screwed. Not to mention what that does to art, in the process. But, I just think that absolutely, the cynicism is very important, and I think that's what's great about people, but gay people, but I wonder a little bit about our own levels of never being able to take that rest, to say, yes, progress happens, and we have to commend ourselves for the fact that we've been part of that progress, which doesn't mean that it's Elin Harris or Out or, or even Leslie's book, but that we can, what troubles me is that we never do that thing of taking a deep breath and saying, we've all worked really hard, this has been a movement, and the movement has made progress, and that's about power. And we might want to think about how we manipulate that power. What I worry about is that we're too busy deconstructing it and disempowering ourselves. What's wrong with getting one up on straight women on the subway? What's wrong with confusing them? What's wrong with that woman going home at night and having a fantasy maybe that, hey, wow, now I'm, what would it be like to sleep with a woman? I mean, these are the opportunities we open up for ourselves in being subversive with media. So I think there's something to be said for that too.
I have more of a comment than a question, and I hope it's not too terribly confused. I'm a little disgruntled at the premise of what images should we present, because that essentially is the same reservation that the man on the right had, that we're taking too much into account straight people's discomfort with truth and reality, and therefore we have to pick and choose what we want to show. Why the fuck are we censoring ourselves so that other people are comfortable?
Because it's a political, and because the discussion is essentially political. I mean, one of the problems going on here is, are we talking about these, say, cultural products qua art, right? Or are we falling into the political mode, which is, I think, basically what is fueling this discussion, which is when you say, how should we present ourselves? It's a political question. And if you're going to follow the political question, then, and this is probably not going to be popular, but you cannot be naive, and you have to sort of play a political game, in which case image management becomes an issue. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, or I am proposing that, or anything like that. I'm just saying that if you are treating this material as essentially political, that it has to have a 7% representation of Jewish gays, it has to have, both discussion, or you're having a certain discussion.
You can't, the whole point, the entire point is you cannot control it. You cannot control it. James Baldwin wrote Giovanni's Room. No one fucking told him he could or he couldn't do it. He wrote it. Adrienne Rich wrote the poetry that she wrote way before she even practically knew she was a lesbian. These things happen. How we control that is the worst impulse we can have. Yes, we can look at the media we make and we can say, let's go through this and find out that only 12% of the images are of Asian American lesbians, and there should be, according to my readership, 15 or 20. Absolutely, let's critique. But the very notion that we could in any way, shape, or form control this thing is so naive and crazy, and it runs counter to everything we've worked for the last 25 years, which is more, more, more. Once more is out there, it's over. It's out there. People are going to do what they want to do. It's like who controls it is any number of people.
Well, I guess part of also the whole thinking behind the whole presentation is not just let's all sit in the room and decide how the community how the so-called public will look at us, but also who sits in the room and makes those decisions. Who makes, because not all of us get to make the same kinds of decisions about what images get put out there. So that was part of the thinking of the way this was organized. I'm sorry, this gentleman and then this gentleman, I think we'll have time for maybe a question more.
Yeah, I was really interested in what Leslie had to say, and I think that, because I was interested in everything everyone on the panel had to say and what I'm hearing everyone else say. The interesting thing that I find is that it seems to me as many people are in this room, there's as many images that there are. So how can we even come to it? And I agree with them. I think that we have to accept that all these images are necessary and essential and that there is no control. When Leslie pointed out the issue of coalition, the issue of economics, is I think that's where we need to put some more emphasis on how do we bring together these images in some way that all images get some play in this party. And I think it's not so much about whether or not you show me as butch queen or you show me as a queen or as a drag or what or who reads it or who looks at it, who wrote the author. I don't think there can be no pure black love male story. No more than that there can be, but I think that what we have to do is to see that there are all these images are necessary and essential. But how do we take that whole point of economic, political coming together across all of these lines, and that there's not this complete total separation, because essentially as I'm sitting here, what I'm feeling is that what we begin to do, because I will assume most of us in here we have our own images and we have some sense of liberalism and acceptance of all this. But yet we're finding a need to divert ourselves and become very separate from what is the whole point. The whole point is how do we bring together that all images are possible, and that through all images that all are accepted as they are. And I think that's the point that's being missing here, because we can go through a whole discussion around how each one of you critique how each image is not representative of this, it's not representative of that, but yet that does not get us to the main issue. And the issue is how do we get some economic and some political suavity among ourselves to make sure that all images are accepted wherever and however they come.
Okay, I'm sorry. I believe it was this gentleman. Yes.
I guess what I want to ask, and what mainly brought me to the discussion tonight, is the concern about how our images can be manipulated and used, I think, for propaganda purposes by the far right. And I guess how they did during the era of Amendment 2 versus Colorado, and a lot of those fights in the Midwest and throughout the rest of the country. And I'm just wondering, now I know it's an open debate of what can we do with those images? Should we take an active role in it? Is there anything we can do? Or should we sit passively by as this propaganda and our images get manipulated and distorted like this? Or do we make an active response to that?
Perhaps you can tell us what kinds of images.
Well, like for instance, the video Gay Agenda. It's distributed to most of Congress at various different points of different while they were voting on different acts, and the Defense of Marriage Act, and throughout the different states that were voting on their own variations of Amendment 2. I mean, they had the gay agenda, variations of the gay agenda, as well as just a way through videos as well as other forms, our own images got distorted, and the information from the images got distorted.
Yeah, I guess I'm just confused about what those images, do you mean nudity or?
Nudity interviews, the images from our pride parade.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, just from our diversity, but being manipulating those images rather than being able to respond to them.
But when you say manipulate, I mean, this is sort of getting to the, beating heart of this matter. When you say manipulate, is it that, I mean, we all know, I think, what you're talking about, that they'll string together, all of the outtakes of the parade of things that are perceived by the audience of this anti-gay video as being the most obnoxious things about, say, gay experience in fact. So, hence, that's the thing. But you can't, you cannot simultaneously, it seems to me, argue that we have to be seen in all of our diversity. And, and in fact, to go back to what we were talking about before, that the strongest, least palatable to the mainstream things must be allowed to get out there. And then by the same token say, well, look, they're showing the strongest, least palatable aspects of our experience to members of Congress. So I think that this is sort of what Sarah was saying.
They strung them together with, the overview is, gay men eat 400 pounds of sperm a day,
Yeah,
right. I'm not saying
they put them together.
Right, I'm not defending the practice of stringing all of the nipple clamp sequences together, but I'm saying that, if you want nipple clamps, voila, nipple clamps, and that you cannot, in this way that Sarah is talking about, you cannot, once you create your images, especially in American culture, which is nothing if not about images, and then try to control their consumption on the other end as well. Although God knows, all of Madison Avenue was built for precisely that purpose. But so I think that I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not saying it's not a bad thing, but I just think I wonder if we're saying we want to eat our cakes and have it too by being vexed by this. And I think that one of the things about the culture of images is that once they're out there, they're out there. I mean, the best thing that you could do is to make your own documentaries and whatever.
Right, and when people like Jerry Falwell take the page about magazine that has the 38 openly gay members of the Clinton administration in it, and he xeroxes it and uses it in a piece of propaganda, you then sue him because he didn't get copyright permission to use it. You think strategically about how you're going to fight these people, because otherwise you're passive. And that's the kind of stuff we have to learn how to do. Be really wily and nasty.
I think I agree with I think that you're powerless over the images. Once they're in the universe, they're there. It's for people to do with them what they will. The only power that we do have is the ability to create our own images. And one good example is I think there was this video that was going around that was being particularly shown to a lot of black churches.
It was the gay agenda.
It was gay agenda. Right. Now there's a great piece that's just come out called All God's Children.
Look, there's another one specifically. You were talking about not the gay agenda. It was actually about
Gay rights. That was it. That was specifically targeting black churches and trying to make this connection. That there's a false connection between civil rights. Okay. Now there's a wonderful video that's just come out called All God's Children, which is black gays and lesbians and our allies, talking about our experiences in the church, our spirituality, and that would be our response to it. I wouldn't even want to call it our response to it. It could be used tactically as our response to it, but it stands on its own as sort of a wonderful introduction for straight church-going black folks about who black gays are.
And I also think that there's two responses. Those of us who don't have access to filmmaking or whatever, we can deal with it too, because really It's a political challenge for us to defend the diversity that exists. There's two responses when the right wing comes out and baits us on what are essentially weak spots of the movement, gender baiting or around sex and desire, etc. It's one to say, well, we're not all like that, you know, and try to throw everybody who's embarrassing or discriminated against in a way we're not overboard. But of course, you cannot throw enough people overboard to satisfy those who make the gay agenda claims. So all you can do is weaken the movement and narrow it. So it's like, it's me and you, and I'm not so sure about you. Or you can say, well, a lot of us are like that. And we can try to be able to defend every single constituency that's under attack. And that's what a meeting like this does. It enables us to sit in a room together and say, you may not have this experience, but I do. And this is where we're different. This is where we're similar. Where can we find common ground to organize effectively?
Or even say, so-and-so may be walking naked down the street on Gay Pride Day, but that doesn't mean that you should be able to fire him just because you don't like that, because they're irrelevant.
Come again?
I was saying, I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, you can, images that some of us find unpalatable, or we say, all right, yeah, there are guys with hairy asses hanging out their chaps on Gay Pride Day, and gee, I don't like to look at that any more than you do. But the fact that they're there, how is this relevant to what you're saying? I mean, what we're fighting about, for example, if we're fighting about anti-discrimination protections, the fact that a gay man may be walking down the street like that has nothing to do with our fight for anti-discrimination protections. And that's what I mean when I say we should be a little bit more confrontational with people who try to make us feel defensive by saying, well, you know, just because you have people who walk around naked on the streets is a reason for you not to have the anti-discrimination protections you're seeking.
I was actually asked that question on national television on CBS this morning once they showed the gay agenda tape. It was right before the March on Washington. It was supposed to be this upbeat thing, you know, and all of a sudden they're showing the gay agenda. How do you feel about those images? I was like, oh, this is real fucking nice. I said, well, you know, I said, that's fine. I said, you know, what if I went to Shea Stadium on a Friday night and took a camera and filmed Bob and Bud and Terry getting blasted on beer? I could call that an image of the American heterosexual male at play. You know, that wouldn't be real attractive either. I mean, you know, part of it is like going back at people, having some levity, having some aggression, absolutely. But, you know, that's about a movement being confident, self-confident enough to say, yeah, you know, how does that relate to equal housing opportunities?
Exactly.
You know, absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question. This gentleman has been...
What I see here, I really love the presentation. What I see again from a large number of panelists, too much infighting with ourselves rather than getting out there and kicking ass for people that are making very significant images, whether it's TV stations, people that are broadcasting this, people that are advertising this, giving them money for that. And I agree very strongly with Leslie. I mean, I can make a point and attack the gay community if I chose to, and I'll mention this point, that I've seen films of the last year's Gay Pride March. And I've seen everybody showing, including the flamboyant queens, but when the transsexual people walked by, which I was the agent of, we were cut out of the film. Why? We were embarrassing? Maybe. But I don't want to attack the gay and lesbian community and bisexual community or other transgender people who don't feel the way I do. I think what we should all do is work together and attack the people that are really controlling the media. We're not really controlling the media. If we think we are, we're really deluding ourselves with that, okay? And Ellen is a whitewash in many meanings of the term, okay? And America has for centuries, or at least since my lifetime, has co-opted everything that has been radically different and made it into something that's sold on every street corner. That's what we don't want to do. If we have any control over it, we want to keep as diverse as possible, show who we are in every single light, but we want to kick ass out there. I mean, act up. We need people like act up used to be. We need to be throwing fucking condoms, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We need to be doing some real actions out there. We need more of that rather than just partying every single night. My comment.
Since we only have one last question. We'll take that and then we'll wrap up.
I still think that some of the panelists are being somewhat simplistic and suggesting that there isn't a real problem with there being gay images created by gay people that are the equivalent of black people being shown in the Birth of a Nation. I mean, there were several black people shown in the Birth of a Nation, but does anyone want to be that black person? Gidget is, you know, an all-American girl, but how many women want to be that girl in 1997? Images, just to be out there, is not the same as being depicted as who we are. And I disagree with this notion of not talking. We should be critical of each other. It's only then that we will be able to get over this reality that too many people who do control what the gay images are who are gay perpetuate positive images of people who look like them and sometimes contribute to negative images of people who are gay or transgender or lesbian who don't look like them.
Can I just say one thing about that? I have to say that I agree entirely with you, but I just wrote a front page cover story on Ellen and what I thought was cheesy about it and what I thought was limited about it and what I found repugnant about Ellen's behavior and what I found entirely non-expressive about that situation outside of the hype. And then I got a couple letters that really made me think twice about my very New York, oh-so-groovy attitude from people in the Midwest, from young kids. This woman wrote me like a 3-page diatribe about how she felt really upset by the level of cynicism about Ellen. Because to her, I mean, really, honestly, I'm highly cynical about it. And I've dealt with all of Ellen's managers and the whole thing, and it makes me kind of sick to my stomach. But the fact of the matter is, there are people at different levels all over this country. And to some people, Ellen means something. And who am I to judge? If it gets somebody out of the closet, that's a good thing. I mean, you know, we have to keep that in mind. Not all of us are New York sophisticates who analyze the media. Some people are at stage 1 of coming out, and any reinforcement helps them. So all I'm saying is I was chasing today. I read my mail, and I thought, you know what? It's important to look twice before you say, yeah, I think we should be really cynical. I'm always that way, but I just, you know, maybe there's some caution needed.
Well, I mean, the problem is, again, it's the phrase, you know, who we really are, which you use. And I wonder if that's not where the simplistic thinking is, in a sense. Because, you know, I think it would probably be fair to say that most of the gay people really are not like anybody in this room. I mean, most of the gay people in America. But I don't know what most gay people are like. And that's why the only answer, in a sense, is to get as many and as diverse a group of images out there. Because I'm not going to sit here, or even if I'm the head of NBC, I'm not going to say, well, this is who gay people really are, and this is the image, therefore, of them that needs to be produced. Because my guess is that, you know, most of the people who watched Ellen were thrilled and delighted. You know, and if I sit on West 23rd Street and say, well, it wasn't this, it wasn't that, it wasn't, you know, I'm not most gay people. And I think that's where the simplistic thinking is, in a sense, is to posit a sort of unified model of who a gay person could be, that these things we then judge according to how much they stray from the model.
Well, if I understood your comment, what Walter said is that it's one thing to fight to get representation. It's another thing to fight for representation that's not demeaning or degrading or contrary to how the people who are being depicted themselves want to be portrayed. And that's something I think we should pay a great deal of attention to and open up more dialogue and communication about it. And I think it's a very valid and important talk about images. It's not just enough to be on the news. It's, are you, doing some keynote address at some banking convention, or are you being led along in chains reinforcing some idea of, who are the criminals in this society? And I think that that's a very important point that you raised, and it's too bad in a way that it got raised towards the end. Thank you for raising.
And I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight, especially our panelists. Where's Judith? Where's Judith Myra? Oh, the program director of the Burke Institute for agreeing to bring this exhibition and these related events to the public. And to ask everybody, if they could, ask by the committee to hold up their chair and put it against the column.